Hey, good evening. Welcome everyone to Frontline Dispatches on Organizing Upgrade, a show dedicated to spotlighting the most urgent left organizing and activism happening around the country and beyond for racial and economic justice and so much more. Please stay tuned for future episodes of Frontline Dispatches every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, at 6 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Pacific. My name is Montague Simmons. I'll be your host this evening. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please leave comments in the chats. We will be monitoring those as the show goes on. And if you have not yet, please give Organizing Upgrade a like and subscribe to this channel. And finally, to stay up to speed with all the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade, sign up at our website, organizingupgrade.com, to hear about upcoming events, videos, articles about left strategy for organizers. With that, let's jump into it. Our guest tonight is Sumaya Awad. She's a Palestinian writer and activist focusing on Palestine, Islamophobia, immigration, and labor. Sumaya is currently the director of strategy at the Adalah Justice Project and the co-editor of Palestine, A Socialist Introduction. And she's a member of New York City's Democratic Socialists of America. Welcome, Sumaya.
It's so great to be here.
No, thank you for making time to talk to us this evening. So for folks that are watching with us, I'm hoping we can actually use this conversation to help ground them tonight and advance why it's important not only to pay attention to what's happening in Palestine, but to make it clear that it's important for our movements to be involved around regarding Palestine. Sumaya, when you get into conversations with folks about the movement, how do you actually ground them? What's your introduction to understanding like why there is an ongoing struggle around Palestine?
Well, I think the starting point is pretty simple, right? It's that Israel, as it currently stands, as an ethno-state, as a settler colony, as an apartheid system, is incompatible with justice, with any vision for justice. And that this has been ongoing for decades. This is nothing new, right? That this isn't about a specific government in Israel that's in power. Just like it's not here in the US when we think about successive US administrations, it's not that one US administration is creating the system that we're up against, but that's actually successive administrations, just like in Israel, that from the very start, from 1948, even before that, if you want to dig deeper, but let's say 1948, that for over 7 decades, Israel has been colonizing Palestinian land and has been doing so under the cover of a political ideology, Zionism. And that, in fact, Israel's project is inherently about supremacy, about Jewish supremacy. And that what that entails is the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, right? The erasure of Palestinian identity. And of course that it doesn't exist in isolation, but it's actually part of this global system of imperialism, that actually imperialism is what allowed Israel to come to be in the first place. And militarism and of course capitalism as sort of the foundation of all of this is what allows Israel to thrive in the same way that US empire is thriving today, and that the two actually build off of one another. So for anyone in the US that's thinking, hey, how do I fight for system change? How do I fight against racism? How do I fight against climate change? Of course, you have to think about how do you confront US militarism and global militarism as like a really key foundation that's propping up all of these different columns that we're fighting against.
Okay, and I want to lean into something you mentioned. Like there has also been a long history of interconnectedness and solidarity between the movement for Palestinian liberation and the Black liberation movement. It goes back from Malcolm X to Mary Baraka, the Black Panthers, James Baldwin, and not to mention this current political moment. Can you say more on like why and where we tend to find such alignment and deep relation?
Definitely. I mean, there's so many threads to take up when it comes to, why there's this really powerful and inspiring Black Palestine solidarity. And I want to just take up 2. The first is internationalism, both within the the movement for Black lives, the movement for Black liberation against racism, and then, of course, within the Palestine movement. And what I mean by that is a really solid understanding and conviction that we are not free unless we are all free. That, in fact, our liberation is tied together not out of a moral, ethical bond, although that exists, but actually a material bond. That our freedom is actually tied together. That any advance in the movement for Black liberation here in the US is an advance for the movement for Palestinian liberation, and vice versa. And that's because of the system that we live under, right? That's because of capitalism, because of how everything is intricately tied. And I think one of the examples, there are many, is militarism, right? Is weapons. So, Israel produces the most weapons per capita globally. And is, in the lead in surveillance technology, et cetera. And of course, all of that is used, it's exported to the world, and of course to the US government, which uses it to surveil activists. We know they surveilled Black Lives Matter activists over the course of the last 6 years, but also going way back to many of the figures that you mentioned from the 50s, 60s, 70s onward. And of course, in shared trainings, shared military technology, et cetera. But I think what really grounds it is this idea that we have to think beyond borders, right? Like these borders are constructed for us, but in fact, our liberation is tied together, and that's the only way to win, right? They try to separate us, to isolate us, to turn us against one another, but in fact, our freedom is tied to one another, and this extends also to the Black Panther Party and different Palestinian liberation movements. We're really one of the sort of links, I think, was this understanding that working class people and oppressed people all over the world have to stand together if we're going to go up and actually confront the tentacles of capitalism. That needs to happen, and that's the only way we win. And in fact, what we've seen in the last 6 years is proof of that. I mean, there's been decades of proof of that, but if you just look at the last 6 years and you look at the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and you look at the rise of the Palestine movement in the US and elsewhere, and this shift in consciousness that we're seeing, right? Like there's a left in the US for the first time in a long time. It's no coincidence that that's happening and really growing during all of these protests, these Black Lives Matter protests, and these BDS campaigns, like the Ben and Jerry's one that just happened last week.
Okay. Can we go deeper into BDS? The campaign to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, and specifically companies that are actually doing business with Israel, has received not only attention recently, but much like other organizations that actually engage in nonviolent protest, as all of a sudden received a backlash. And we're seeing litigation or legislation pass not only at the state level, but attempts to pass legislation at the federal level to restrict your ability to resist. Can you talk more about the BDS campaign, what are its aims and where it is in this moment? And specifically, you mentioned what's happening with Ben and Jerry's. For the audience, that I think some of them also may hear conflicting messages. So I'd be interested to hear your take on it.
Most definitely. So, BDS, as you just mentioned, BDS is Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions campaign, and it was launched in 2005 by Palestinian civil society. So organizations on the ground, grassroots organizations, labor unions in Palestine and in the diaspora, saying, hey, if you're in the international community and you want to stand up against apartheid, against settler colonialism, against what we're facing as Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing we're facing, the denial of our rights, for example, the right of return, then what we ask is for you to boycott Israel, to divest from Israel, from companies that are complicit in our oppression, and to apply sanctions on Israel. And it was actually very much inspired by the movement, the Boycott Apartheid South Africa movement, but also many other boycotts that have existed, right? For centuries, people have been turning to boycotts as a way to apply pressure to make systems of oppression change, because we know they're not going to change on their own, right? They have no incentive to change on their own. We need to pressure them to do so. And that's what BDS is. In some ways, it's very simple and nothing new. But of course, it's really villainized, and advocates, Palestine advocates and allies that support BDS, that champion it as as a way to pressure Israel to comply with international law, again, very basic, are really villainized and are painted as anti-Semitic. And there are, as you mentioned, there's legislation in the U.S. to persecute these, anyone that engages in BDS. In fact, there's actually, I think, 220 or over 220 bills in the United States that attempt to criminalize in one way or another, or penalize anyone that engages in Palestine advocacy. And many of these are specifically about BDS. 23% of them have passed. But what we saw with Ben & Jerry's, and I'm glad you brought that up. So last week, Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company, decided to it won't renew its contract in the occupied West Bank in settlements, right? Settlements that are illegal under international law. It said, we're not going to renew our contract with the company in the settlement that distributes our ice cream, with our distributor. And they also said that they wanted to end all relations with Israel as an apartheid state, because it doesn't sit well with their values, right? They don't want to operate in an apartheid system, because that indirectly and directly helps to prop up this apartheid regime and this settler colonial project. Now, there's work to be done to get them to fully move out of Israel, but for now, they've said that they will not renew this contract with this distributor. And it's fairly simple, right? It's saying, hey, we don't want to support apartheid. You would think everyone would be like, yes, this is a great move. Why didn't you do it 20 years ago? Why isn't every company doing this? But instead, what we've seen is an all-out attack on ice cream, right? There have been all of these statements released saying what Ben & Jerry's is doing is horrible, is anti-Semitic. And there's actually been this push by the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Trying to get 35 states to enhance their anti-BDS laws to include Ben & Jerry's. Wow. They're saying we need to punish Ben & Jerry's for their decision to say no to apartheid. And so it's in some ways it's laughable, right? Because it's an ice cream company saying, I don't want to support apartheid, and you get this backlash. And in other ways, it really shows you the power of the Israel lobby, the power of the state of Israel to say, we're going to punish anyone that tries to hold us accountable, even if it's a very small act. We're gonna show you that you shouldn't be doing this. It also shows that they're scared, because there is a shift in consciousness. People are seeing Israel for what it is, a settler colonial state, a militarized apartheid state. And of course that scares Israel, because it doesn't want to be held accountable.
Can you say more in terms of this? Like, because it feels like you mentioned that the BDS campaign started 2005. Like in this case, like if we're clear and honest about it, like the decision by Ben & Jerry's does not stop the military like literally engaging in warfare in the settlement. It doesn't like cause material change, but it feels like it does have something more symbolic that's threatening not only interest directly in Israel, but interest in the U.S.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you're right? This doesn't have a material impact yet. But what it does, it sets a precedent. It shows other companies that, hey, you're gonna feel the pressure too, and you shouldn't be operating in illegal Jewish-only settlements. You shouldn't be operating in Israel. Israel is a settler colonial state, and it's been charged with apartheid, right? Human Rights Watch, one of the leading organizations globally in human rights, officially charged Israel with apartheid and with persecution at the end of April. And actually called on the UN to consider sanctions. And so what this means is it's all coming to light. What Palestinians have been saying for decades is actually getting into the mainstream. And there is this shift in consciousness that we're seeing in the US in particular, which is a very important place just because of the funding that goes to Israel, right? The US gives Israel $3.8 billion a year in military funding that is used to buy drones, to man the checkpoints between Palestinian cities and villages, to uphold the blockade on Gaza, etc. And this $3.8 billion package for 10 years was signed under Obama, right? It was actually Biden that flew to Israel to make sure this funding package went through. So it's not about, it's not something that just happened under Donald Trump, but it's actually successive U.S. administrations that have made it very clear they are loyal to Israel, regardless of what it does, regardless of how many Palestinians it kills, regardless of how suffocating the blockade on Gaza is. It doesn't matter. They're going to be remain loyal and to justify all of Israel's actions, and more than that, to justify the persecution of Palestinian activists and Palestine solidarity activists here in the U.S. Even though many of the ways that they're trying to go after Palestine solidarity activists are unconstitutional, but of course, who does the Constitution really serve? I feel like I went on kind of a tangent, but
no, not at all. Like, I'm interested again in going deeper. Like, I'm curious, like, especially when we talk about the levels of military spending and policy decisions that have deep impact directly in the settlements. How do we as organizers working directly in the U.S., how do we have an impact? What choices can we make that can directly impact and support the campaign?
That's a great question. So with BDS, there are several ongoing campaigns in the U.S. That you can plug into depending on your context. I'll name a few. One of them is the movement to end the relationship between the deadly exchange, right? Which is that a lot of police officers in the U.S. get trained in Israel, and it's to cut that, to stop that from happening, because one, it allows the Israeli forces to sort of normalize what they're doing against Palestinians, and two, it exports all of this surveillance technology, all of these military tactics to U.S. police officers who then use them here. And of course, this is obvious, but I'll say it, and it's that U.S. police, cops in this country have been doing what they've been doing for decades, long before Israel existed. So it's not that Israel is giving them this new technology or implementing this particularly violent methods of policing that's always existed. It's enhancing it in different ways, and they're sort of using this shared technology, shared training, shared ideologies to persecute and to kill in both settings. So the End the Deadly Exchange is one campaign. The other that's sort of ongoing is against Boeing. So Boeing, most people know, is about Boeing because it's the airplane you take to fly home for whatever, Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever it is that you fly home. Whenever you fly home or travel, you're usually in a Boeing aircraft. It's one of the largest in the world. It also supplies the technology that Israel uses and the aircraft that drop bombs on Gaza. So in May, during the latest bombing campaign, many of the machinery that was used was from Boeing. And Boeing is headquartered here in the U.S., and so there's an ongoing campaign against Boeing to pressure them to end all contracts with Israel and to refuse to have their their aircraft, their machinery, their technology be used by the military, whether it's in Israel or elsewhere. We know the U.S. also does this a lot, and it has its whole drone program. So those are two. Ben & Jerry's is not over. There's still pressure that needs to be applied to ensure that Ben & Jerry's and all of its contracts with Israel, including its manufacturing. It has a manufacturing facility just outside of Tel Aviv. So the call to really pull Ben & Jerry's out of Israel fully is ongoing. When Palestinians say, we don't want any company to work with Israel to be complicit in our oppression, and they mean from the river to the sea. They don't mean just this part or that part of Palestine. They mean all of Palestine, which should be intuitive, right? If your land has been taken from you, if your home had been taken from you, you don't want one room back. You don't want just the kitchen back. You want the full thing. You want all of your land back. You want all of your rights back, not just a sliver.
That's right. To our audience, you are watching Frontline Dispatches on Organizing Upgrade. Whether you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, please leave comments, leave your questions in the chat. We are watching, we're looking and listening to you in this moment. Again, our guest tonight is Sumaya Awad. She is the Director of Strategy at the Adalah Justice Project and a co-editor of Palestine, A Socialist Introduction. Okay. So one, I'll say personally, like this lands on me like very deeply in part because doing the work that we actually saw like in Ferguson, Palestinians were some of the first folks that actually reached out to us and showed solidarity in terms of facing folks in the streets. Can you talk about like what's happened over recent years in terms of like activity? We've seen more and more both organizing, especially over the last year. But I'm curious to see, has the solidarity actually deepened, like in the face of obviously the U.S. and other forces trying to drive wedges between us?
I think the solidarity has definitely deepened. And I think part of that is because of, just how bad things have gotten. I mean, the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer everywhere in the world. And in the US, we've seen this play out in so many ways, from the lack of healthcare, our failing infrastructure. The other day in New York City, not the other day, I think it was yesterday, one of the there was this sidewalk explosion. Anyway, so my point is there's like everything is getting worse and people are fed up. And that's why I think there are all of these movements that are coming out, right? Like for Medicare for All, against climate change, the growth of the movement for Black Lives, the rebellion that swept the country last year. And that on this year, on the anniversary of that, almost the anniversary of that, we saw this mass movement that sort of was awakened in Palestine, right? There was a national strike in Palestine. I don't think it's a coincidence that all of these things are happening around the same time. It's because people are fed up and people are demanding more. And people are sick of hearing the same old lies being told over and over again, in the US, but elsewhere as well. And so I think because of that, it's become so much harder for Israel, so much harder for Zionists to get away with saying, oh, no, Palestinians are the problem. No, it's the Palestinians that are violent. These lies are just, they seem so silly now, because what you're seeing is this imbalance of power, just like anywhere else, right? You're seeing a government that has nuclear power, that is backed by the the world's largest empire, that gets millions of dollars and billions of dollars in funding, up against a colonized people, right? A people that are being ethnically cleansed, that are being forced out of their homes on live TV with guns in their faces. Earlier today, an 11-year-old Palestinian, Hamad al-Alami, was shot and killed. He was in the backseat of his car as his family was driving home from a grocery store. So the same lies that Israel is telling about Palestinians being the instigators, they're really falling apart. And people are starting to see Israel for what it is, right? A settler colonial state. And to see Zionism for what it is, which is an inherently racist ideology that is used to cover up what Israel is doing to Palestinians. And so I think that there is this shift in consciousness. There is this solidarity that's growing as people like make the tie together all these things. And in some ways, I think the last few years in particular, and sort of the response to COVID, has also really shown that. It's shown that we really have only each other to rely on, and that our struggles are connected. And that's what we need to keep building and deepening. And I think the urgency is very real. For a lot of the reasons that we both mentioned today, the urgency is very real. And we have this opportunity right now where people are angry, where people are making connections, where people are seeing past the same old lies. And to be frank, where we have some representation in the halls of power that we haven't had representation before, right? Like people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and AOC and others. And I think that makes a difference, not because they are going to lead us to our liberation, but they are part of this larger movement that is pushing for something new. And we're not going to have, I don't think that we're going to have this opportunity for very long, right? I think that, as history has shown us, there, the ebbs and flows of power and of the growth of the left, and then it kind of dies down and it comes back. And so I think we have this very important moment right here, and so much potential that we haven't yet reached. And I think with BDS in particular, like now is the time to join a BDS campaign. Now is the time to push to incorporate Palestine into all of our struggles, our labor struggles. Labor in the U.S. is growing right now, labor movement, and how do we incorporate that? How do we incorporate internationalism into all of our struggles to really have a material change on the lives of Palestinians?
That's right. And how do listeners actually begin to plug into the campaign?
Great question. So if you, for Ben & Jerry's in particular, actually for all of the campaigns I mentioned, if you go to bdsmovement.org or .net, I'm sorry, and I believe the links are going up in the comments. You can see how to plug into the campaign. If you visit Adalah Justice.org, you can also see ways to plug in. Specifically around Boeing, but also around Gaza. We're hoping to launch a campaign around Gaza very soon and sort of connect it to some of these other BDS campaigns. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And also, I'm a member of Democratic Socialists for America, and I would also really highly recommend people join DSA and join an organization and fight within it, fight through it. With all of the other tens of thousands of people that are trying to push for system change in the U.S. and beyond.
First to our audience, if this conversation touched you, we encourage you, one, to stay up to speed, not only with the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade, but definitely to visit the links, visit the BDS site, visit Adalah Justice Project. Plug in. There are important events that are coming up. There are videos. There's more material for education, especially for folks that are actually organizing. Thank you, Sumaya. Thank you, Sumaya, so much for making time to be with us this evening. I think you're amazing. I think you're brilliant. Is there anything that you would leave, especially like most of the folks who actually plug in are organizers? So if there's something if there's a charge that you would give them this evening, what would that be?
So many things come to mind, but I'm actually going to say one thing that I forgot to say earlier that may not, necessarily directly respond to what you just said. But, this is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And one of the things that happened after 9/11, as we all know, was how Islamophobia was used to ram through all sorts of policies and programs to really persecute activists, of course, Muslims and Arabs, but also just anyone that dared to protest or criticize the state and certainly criticize U.S. militarism. And I think that when we think about all of the different attacks that all of our movements have been facing, whether it's the movement for Black Lives, the Palestine movement, the climate movement, et cetera, oftentimes the language that's used is all around, these charges of terrorism and charges of national security. And I think that it's important to name that because I think a lot of the left still hasn't fully gotten that right, that we need to go up against this and actually need to push back and say, we reject all of these terms to be applied to anyone. We reject any attempt to use Islamophobia to divide our movements. And of course, this has reverberations on literally everything, every single way we fight, from, against the prison system and against mass incarceration, to against border policies and immigration policies, against racism, and against U.S. empire and the U.S. war machine, which is still raging abroad. So I think I'll end with that. It was a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And to our audience, thank you again for joining us. Please stay tuned we will be back next week and honestly continue this discussion around Palestine. Frontline Dispatches come to you every Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Pacific. Again, thank you so much to the brilliant and amazing Sumaya Awad. Thank you to Adalah Justice Project, and we will see you again next week.